Thank you for coming to the latest installment of the History Club's Chicano History Lecture Series. Today we have Professor Annie Buckley with us, and she's going to be discussing Chicano art. First, I'd like to thank the University Diversity Committee, the Intellectual Life Fund, Rong Cheng, and our advisors, Drs. Jeremy Murray and Brian Keene. Professor Annie Buckley is a multidisciplinary artist, writer, curator, and editor with an emphasis on art and social justice. She is an associate professor of visual studies and the director of CSUSB Community-Based Art, CBA, an initiative that facilitates art at sites that don't otherwise have access to it, including 3 prisons, youth shelters, and low-income housing. Buckley is the author of hundreds of articles, reviews, and essays on contemporary art, and several nonfiction books for youth on topics including racism, homelessness, and the arts. Her visual and participatory art is regularly included in museums, galleries, and public exhibitions. She is the curator of the exhibition Bridging Homeboy Industries and the editor and co-founder of the new online publication Radical Actions from Teaching Artists to Social Practice. Please welcome Professor Buckley.
Thank you. Thank you for that nice, oh, I think I'm supposed to, okay, yeah. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I think this is such a great series, and I'm happy to be part of it, so thank you. And with that, I'll go ahead and begin. So as you heard, we're going to be talking about Chicano art, and I have the /A because Chicano or Chicana art, and we'll get into a little bit about why it can be either or both. And I'm going to be at some points asking you for input and feedback as well, so there'll be some moments where we'll participate together, and sometimes to just be looking and a little mix of all of the above. So the first one is really going to come from you. So before I begin, I wanted to ask you, what sort of things do you think define Chicano art or Chicana art, and what images come into your head? So just, who has thoughts on that? You have one, I can tell.
Specifically Mexican art.
Okay, Mexican art, okay. I had an idea of writing it in here, but now I can't, so we'll just remember. Okay, Mexican art. What else?
Religious icons.
Religious icons, okay. No, okay. Anything else? Yes.
Some historical events,
Historical events, yeah. Can you say more about that?
such as Mexican Revolution.
Okay. Any others that come to mind?
Oh, probably the migration from Mexico or Latin America to here.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, okay, good. So these are some of the ideas and images. What else? Anything else?
Cesar Chavez.
Cesar Chavez. Yes, yes, yes.
Aztec art.
Aztec art. Okay, yeah, good.
Murals.
Murals. Now I'm wishing I was writing it as we went, but we're going to remember these. It's okay. I'll remember. Murals. Anything else? These are all excellent ideas, and you guys are all like have a nice body of knowledge before we even start. Any specific artists, or I know you said religious imagery, any other kinds of like icons or images that come into your head when you hear about Chicano art? I'm looking at your shirt because I'm like kind of like that, right? Okay, so let's move on. Maybe this will spark some other ideas. So one of the things when we look at art, we first begin by just, what do you see? Just very literal. And then from there, we start to use what do you see to begin to interpret images. So for those of you not coming from art, that's just sort of like a basic on how we look at and interpret art. So beginning with that, and I put several together here. Moving on, we'll look at one at a time and go into more detail, but just still looking at that overall. What images, colors, and symbols do you see? So just starting with what do you see? Just let's hear from you. Anything that comes to your mind, what do you see?
Orange.
A lot of orange. Who said that? Oh, okay. A lot of orange. That's interesting, yes. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Well, with the lower right, women are in the forefront.
Oh, that's an interesting observation. And that kind of shows us too how when you begin with what do you see, it quickly verges into interpretation. Because when you just take this literal of women are in the forefront of an image, which is something that you see, then you're beginning to, it also starts to interpret because you think, well, why and what does that mean? So that's an interesting observation. Does this one here, the Self-Help Graphics logo, and we'll talk a little bit about that organization, does that bring to mind any of the things you all spoke about earlier? To me it does, right? Like who said indigenous imagery? Didn't someone say that? Aztec, you said Aztec specifically, yeah. So, so imagery coming from indigenous Mexico and then being brought in and brought over through immigration with people, that is some of the imagery that informs Chicano art. And you see that over here as well, right? What about this guy? What's happening there? A pachuco, right? Who said that? I heard it. Yeah. Yeah, pachuco, you want to say a little more about that? Like, how do you recognize him?
Well, it's like kind of like where like people say like the beginning of the Chicano movement comes from Pachucos.
With the Zoot Suit riots, right? Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, the beginning of the Chicano movement here in the U.S., specifically the Pachucos and the Zoot Suit riots specifically, but just their whole culture. So here interacting with this image of a figure from way back from ancient Mexico, from ancient American society. So these images are many. Oh, and this one too. What about this one? There's a couple things about this that relate, kind of is still an overview of what we'll be looking at. What do you see here? Yeah, we're
Everything
quiet.
like symbolism.
Symbolism? Okay, but what specifically do you see? Like, what's that?
Well, the only thing I can think of is like what Mexico does, Dia de los Muertos, and they do like skull designs.
Yeah, so even already starting to interpret, exactly. So it's a skull, skeleton or skull on the body, right? And then that's just what we see. But then that relates strongly to Dia de los Muertos and Day of the Dead celebration. So then also we have this card format, which does it remind you of Loteria? Anybody? Okay. Hi. And so these, all of these two, and this one too, are all groups that were part of supporting and disseminating Chicano and Chicana art. So all of the things that you have been saying so far is a really good overview of the imagery, the iconography, the colors, and even to some extent, we just barely touched the surface of also the ideas and the meaning of Chicano art and Chicana art. But one of the things that I'm going to focus on today is what, not so much what it looks like, but the sensibility of this approach to art. Because I think it's one of the most unique and special and important things about it that kind of gets forgotten. We think often about like the religious imagery, the iconography of like related to Aztec imagery and to other indigenous religious or cultural imagery, but we sometimes forget that there's a lot of action involved in Chicano art. And actually, where Chicano art is so active with community and participatory projects is something that is very contemporary and was very in the foreground. Like they were in the foreground of a movement that then became something really important in contemporary art. And so I think that these are two things that are like part, on the one hand, it's kind of forgotten within Chicano art, but then secondly, that they were actually radical in terms of contemporary art. And so I feel like that it's important that Chicano art be given that credit, that they did something that then became really important. Like right now, in terms of social practice and public practice and relational aesthetics, those are approaches to art that engage people and engage communities. And Chicano artists were doing that long before. So I think that's important. So just, could somebody, what's the first one say? Let's all read it together. What's that?
Collaboration, partnerships, interrelated, intercultural, intervention, advocacy.
Okay, so those are some of the ideas that we're going to be looking at throughout. And when we talked about what's Chicano art, what do we think of? These aren't necessarily any of the ones that anyone mentioned, although you kind of got into it a little bit with mentioning the migration and then also with Cesar Chavez. So we started to touch on it, but that's what we're going to focus on today. So this piece is called Walking Mural. This is by a group named ASCO. Raise your hand if you have heard of ASCO. Okay, great. So we're going to learn about One of the very prominent, now, historically looking back, Chicano arts groups, and we're kind of starting a little bit after the beginnings, so we're going to start here in 1972, and then we're going to go and look at some of the history that led into it, then we're going to look at some contemporary approaches. But the reason we're starting here is because ASCO, to me, they really represent that idea, that what I was just talking about interaction, collaboration, advocacy. How do we use art not just as something to look at, but to actually change communities and change minds and change how things are functioning? And that's something that the Chicano artists were very invested in. It was never art just because something relaxing or beautiful or pretty to look at. That's important too, as you saw from the images. It's not like just spare, conceptual, bare looking. There's a lot of aesthetics, but it's very engaged. It's very much about like what's happening in our community, how can we make a difference, how can art be part of that? So we'll be looking at different ways of doing that, and OSCO I thought is a great example. What I want to do first is tell you a little bit about them. So they only ran from 1972 to 1987. They actually came out of high school, out of East LA High School, and kind of formed this little group, a collective it's called, with an art group artists that work together as one. They're called a collective. And they just started making work. And the names of the artists involved, like the primary ones were Harry Gamboa Jr., Gronk, Willie Heron, and Patsy Valdez. And do you guys know this word, ASCO?
Yes.
Some of you guys are nodding. What can you tell us? What is it? I mean, it says here, but just your words. What is it?
Like when someone says me that asshole, I'm like, oh, that's really gross. Looks, yeah.
Like, ooh, yeah. So why would why did art group name themselves this?
It's not an acronym?
What?
It's not an acronym?
No, they chose it purposefully. So what might that tell you just from there? Why would they do that? What does that tell you about them?
Discuss about something, I guess.
Discuss about something, yes, that's interesting. And also, I think that they were. I think there were things that were really frustrating and upsetting to them. The violence in their community, the poverty, the racism. And so that's actually really interesting. But when you look historically, why did they choose this name? It's because of the way that people responded to them. Because they were making work that was performance and social intervention, and it wasn't what art was seen as and accepted as at that time in their communities. So people were like, ugh, what are you doing? And they just embraced that and said, okay, we're ASCO. So they used, as it says here, performance, public art, and multimedia, and they wanted to respond to the social and political turbulence in Los Angeles and beyond. I think it's interesting to know that they were pretty short-lived, so they lasted till the 1980s, and their group kind of went like this, as collectives tend to do. So these 4 artists began it and remained engaged throughout, but then other artists were involved for different periods of time. So that's, I'm going to skip that question for now, but I want to go and show you guys a little bit about this piece, and then we're going to hear from one of the artists in a video. So this piece is called the, oh wait a second, I'm sorry, back up to this one. We want to talk about this one first. So this piece is a walking mural. This is a photograph of a public performance, and the photograph is taken by one of the artists in the group, Harry Gamboa Jr. He did all the photography of them. And we're going to hear Patsy Valdez remember her thoughts on doing this piece. And I think it will tell you a lot about it just hearing from her. So does anyone have any questions or comments on this piece before we hear more about it? I'm going to get it out while you guys are thinking about that. No, that's okay. I have this all prepared. Okay, we're going to start with this one. So we'll just hear a little bit about this piece from her. And then if you guys are interested to learn more about ASCO or about their pieces, you can also watch these other videos. There was an exhibition of this group at Los Angeles County Museum of Art a few years ago, and they have like a nice archive of it here. So let's just hear from Patsy Valdez, and I think this will help you tell a little bit more about the piece.
Well, we got together, we were hanging out, and we decided that we were going to recreate or a performance, because what I remember is that after the riots in East Los Angeles, we used to have a Christmas parade. So we decided we would bring the parade back to the neighborhood. And we created our own mini parade. And so that's why it was a holiday thing, and I dressed up as the Virgin. Well, a reinterpretation of the Virgin. And we didn't know what each other was going to wear until the day of the event. And we were going to meet at my house at a particular time. And my mom goes, "Mija, daughter, Grunk's here." So I go, "Oh darn." So I got up and I looked, and through the archway, there comes Grunk. His costume is like this big flouncy green chiffon-y outfit that has big Christmas balls hanging on the edge of it, and is sort of bouncing as he walks. And he has this huge star painted on his face. And I'm like, oh my God, he was a walking Christmas tree. I got dressed in my cardboard and glitter costume. I think Willie's costume was too big to even go through that corridor, and I really can't remember where we met up with him, probably out front. And then when I saw Willie's costume, again, I was flabbergasted. I was blown away with what he did with a piece of masonite and foil. It was shocking to me. And I assume he was playing the Christ figure, carrying the burden of the world, of the people on his back. The other thing that I remember is that I thought, I need bodyguards. As a woman, I had to protect myself, so I thought, okay, my cousin was married to this really big, burly man, Frank, right here. And so I called my cousin Sylvia and her husband, and I said, "Do you think your husband could be my bodyguard?" And she said, "Sure, no problem." One thing I do remember is my demeanor. I made sure that I didn't look at anybody, make eye contact. I really don't know why I came up with this, but I thought, I'm not going to make eye contact. I'm a character. So I'm going to just walk straight ahead. But I could hear some gasping from older women who were walking by. It was during the holidays, so there was Christmas shopping going on. And I could hear words in Spanish like, "Oh my God, dear God, what is this?" Or in Spanish. And I kept my demeanor, and I just looked straight ahead.
Okay, so that's Patsy Valdez talking about this piece, Walking Mural. And when you listen to that, oh, where does that go? I have to go back to this. Sorry, there it is. There we go. So when you listen to that, it really does characterize some of the things that, not only about Chicano art that we were talking about, but specifically about Osco, that was unique and special about them. One of the things is that aspect of being really DIY. They made it themselves. Very fast, very quick, very disposable. It's not precious. A lot of times art, it's about like something to hang on the wall and to admire and to, you know, something special that's one of a kind and very costly. And for them, art was very, very different. It was very like creative and of the spirit and just of the moment. And that's one of the things that characterizes them. They did that all throughout. There's actually one room of the exhibition where they had all these paper costumes that they had made. It was amazing. Very detailed, very ornate, very dramatic, and all made out of paper. So that actually goes into another thing that does characterize them as well, which is just this kind of drama, right? Like just even this. They're just like this sort of scraggly band walking down the street, but at the same time, it's so dramatic. Like the women looking at her like, oh, what is they doing, you know? So it's very traditional type of neighborhood that they were doing this in, and they were responding to their neighborhood, but at the same time, they were embracing their culture, but just showing, oh, it can be a different way. It doesn't have to look the way it's always looked, so we can reinvent, like she talks about reinventing love, and doing like a new interpretation. So those are some, and also that it's very public, right? So this happened in public. A lot of their pieces were very, very public. So does it help you to hear a little from her? Like, does it give you a sense? Is there anything that stands out about what she said that I didn't cover?
The rights.
Oh.
What's that about?
Yeah. Okay, so it was shortly after which ones was it? I'm thinking of the more recent one, right? It's in the 90s, but it's not that. So it's right in the city in Los Angeles, just prior to this. And there was a lot of unrest, a lot of violence in their community, and they're responding against that. And actually, I'm going to go on to the next one because it relates specifically to that. So one of the other pieces that we're going to look at is this one called First Supper After a Major Riot. So this one really specifically relates to that, and we see, so First Supper, what does that make you think of, right? Like, what's the parallel in the religious history? The Last Supper, right? So they're going, no, we're going to reinvent, again, going to their roots, to their religion, and to their culture, but like, let's reinvent it. Let's do the First Supper and after a major riot. But what else do you see in the image that makes you think about, like, the cultural heritage, like the skulls, right? The calaveras that they're painted like that. So that also relates to their culture. And what do you think, so what do you guys think about this in relationship to the riots? Like, what does that mean to go out in the street and dress in this way and have this meal after, and specifically say, this is the First Supper after the major riots? What does that say to you? Like, that's powerful. But before I say what I think, what do you think? What is that saying? Why, what is that doing? Why would they do that?
To claim the space, maybe?
Yeah. Say more about that. That's like, seriously, that's the same way I think about it, that reclamation.
I just think like it wasn't their space. It ceased to be their space when all that violence occurred. So I think like sometimes to reclaim space, you have to go in again where it hurts and to just reinvent it. And I think they do a lot of that. They reinvent things. So maybe that was another reinvention for them. That's what
Yeah, I love the way that you say that. It's very beautiful, and I think that's exactly right. It's like it feels like your neighborhood's being taken away, and in many sense it is, with the violence that was happening, and the racism that was fueling the violence, and the poverty and the socioeconomic divide that was fueling the violence, and still is today in many communities all around us, and that we're part of. And so to reclaim it and to say, no, we're going to come here and we're going to have our first meal. And people were saying, oh, they're young, that's not right, that's not how you do religion, that's not how the religion looks, that's not, the right way to make art. And they were like, no, we're going to take what is ours in our culture, but we're going to do it our way. And I think that that's very much what's happening with this one. So we have one more with Willie Heron and Gronk, and they're posing in front of a mural that they made, and it was black and white mural/muralist. It's kind of funny, just sort of tongue-in-cheek. The only thing I really want to say about this one before we move on is a lot of their work also with being public was more performance-based, and whereas a lot of the other Chicano art, both then and now, is very, like you said, murals? Who said murals? You said murals? Yeah, is public in terms of the art on the walls, and this is one of those, and so I thought it was a good lead-in to we're going to go into more of like an overview Chicano art from there. So one of the things, so we begin with OSCO as really an introduction to what's going to be looking at some contemporary and then, like I said, some historical events that led into it. And then we're going to end up looking on some more community-based practices, which is really important to a lot of Chicano artists. So it embraces a living narrative. I think that that's really important because it's not like history that's dead and gone and past. It's something that's still being made and that evolves, and it's made out of people and actions. It's not made out of like an academic looking back and seeing what happened. It's made out of like people engaging with it and in it. That's not to say there aren't historians of Chicano history. There are, and I'm going to even talk to you about one. But what the art is this living, evolving practice. It's a narrative of visual and social practices that engage activism, community, culture, and contemporary art. And raise your hand if you're from the art department. It's probably my student. Hi. Okay, so for everyone, not so much these guys, I probably know this part, but for the others, some of the things that were important to contemporary art around this same time period. So Chicano art really began around like 60s and 70s was like the highlight, but it began a little earlier, and then it's still going on today, although people don't really, there's not as much to talk about it right now. So, but at that time, 60s and 70s, that they were doing these things, this same approaches that they were doing became very important in contemporary art. But oftentimes they were doing it earlier. Like USCO was doing those things in the 70s. Nobody was doing that in their neighborhoods. That was only just very beginning at, in like New York and different centers of contemporary art around the world. So they were doing that. There's also, the other thing they engage with is serial imagery, repetition. Why might people want to use prints that you could just like repeat and make multiples versus like a painting? What's the benefit of that for people who are real like community-based and want everyone to have access to art?
Spreads the word.
Spreads the word, yeah. What else?
Less expensive and time-consuming.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you get the word out and it's fast and it's cheaper. And if you don't have a lot of money and you're making your art out of, you know, whatever you find in your home, like Patsy Valdez described about their costumes, the idea of prints and printmaking and posters is very important because you get your art out, you get to be creative, you get to create work that can, you know, is a finished piece of art, but it's also, it's more able to be disseminated much more easily. And much more cheaply as well. So there's this idea of serial imagery and also print, posters, zines. The other thing of public practices or happenings. And these relate to both performance art and protest. And you guys mentioned earlier Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, and there was a lot of art around that too, like the posters that were made with it, the prints that were made, that people were holding as they were protesting, and so there was art really engaged with a lot of these, that social movement and with others. Okay, so in this little section, we're just going to look at a couple pieces. These are contemporary, and we're going to just take a little breather from the talking and do a little bit of looking at just a few pieces, and then we're going to go from there into a little bit of more history. So this is by Yarina. Sorry, I don't think I've seen it right. Yarina Cervantes, Mujer de mucha enagua, Pati Chicana. And this is a serigraph, which is a type of a print. So even now, today, like still working with prints and printmaking. I know some of you guys work with printmaking, some of the artists. Okay. So it's a pretty involved print. So to do printmaking, sometimes they're a little bit more fast, and this one is more detailed and more involved. But so let's just begin with this idea of what do you see? Don't interpret, just say what do you see? Like I see a depiction of, so they're not two women, right? But they're a depiction of two women. One is holding a baby and holding the hand of a little girl. There's like a pale yellow background. There's a hand in the middle, like a disembodied hand with a spiral on the palm. What else do you see? Just literal see.
Solinets.
Go ahead and then you go.
Solinets.
What is that?
She is a Mexican nun. She was born to a mother who was never married, so she had her out of wedlock and raised her, and she's brilliant. Like she was said to like correspond with, I don't remember who, somebody really, really like brilliant. And she was a poet. She was amazing. She
still lives one of Mexico's first feminists.
yeah.
And yours, this,
Yeah, that's her.
yes, right?
Solinets,
Sor
yeah.
Juana Inés.
But this is a photo, a depiction of a photo of her,
I don't
and
know
this
if
is
that's-
a portrait.
I don't know if that's her, but I know that
The image, yeah.
the image is her, yeah.
And so this is, so we're already, again, see how the what do you see goes right into interpret. So just with hearing, like what Cynthia's saying with the background. So Mexico's first minister.
Yeah.
Great, I'm sure. So here we see the figure of a woman, but then we now know who and the history. But let's say a little more about what do you see in terms of like, what is she wearing? What's the colors? But we're going to get into that too, but what were you going to say?
I see a snake
like under the hand,
Where do you see this snake?
like is that like under the hand thing, like.
Oh, okay, okay. So under the picture of the hand, there's a picture of a snake
Yeah, like
with.
yeah, I see like a snake head, like on the brazo, snake body. It's crazy. Yeah, it caught my attention.
This part is this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And kind of like two urns or bowls in
Yeah.
front of it, right?
Yeah.
Question, why is that woman or girl has a bandana in her face?
Okay,
Looks like
so-
a bandana.
Yeah, so before we go into why and what, let's keep on going on what we see with the one girl, the picture of the woman on the left, she's holding the child, the two children. She also has her mouth and nose covered by a bandana, right?
Is the blue a reference to the Virgin Mary?
Well, we're gonna not say yet. We're gonna keep saying what do we see, but potentially, right? So nobody has said anything about this background. What do you see in this background? And what is she doing here with this? Some sort of shapes, right? Stars or flower shapes in the background, kind of repeated images covering the space in almost like a decorative way. But over here, can you guys see what these are? What are these?
Hand gestures.
Hands, yeah, hands making different gestures. And they're sort of like a stylized version of a hand. So in this we have representation of the figures, right? And then we have some abstraction with these little shapes in the background. We have some symbolism here. We have, these gestures. So we have a good sense of what, I missed this piece, of what we see, and then the start of the interpretation, right? So we have that potential reference to the Virgin, but before we get into that, so can you say more about her? Oh, I'm sorry, I went. She's like, no, Yogo, I know you have more, but I want you to share.
Oh, well,
Because you were saying there's Mexico's first feminist.
Yeah,
So
because,
let's think about that in relationship to the piece. Yeah, go ahead.
well,
No, it's okay.
She was, she became a member of the church because I gave her the freedom to work in writing, poetry, science, and stuff she would be able to do otherwise.
And so you kind of see that represented in this symbolically, right? And so it was more about religion, not so much, I mean, not that she didn't have faith, but like more about a means to do towards freedom for her within a patriarchal society. That's interesting. There's a history of that with nuns that are very radical and very artistic and go into the religion, but use it for social change. So what was the era? Do you guys know her time period? 17th century. So when we think about this image here, right, and we have this history on the right of this nun who we heard about, and then we have this woman who's wearing this, who's covered over in that way and holding those children. So how do we tie all of that together? What do you think the artist is saying or communicating with this?
Maybe what we come from,
So say more about
like culturally what, because like to me this is, because it represents being a Mexican woman. And like even just the symbolism, like the hand, that's the indigenous symbol that, you know, in the middle. But I just feel like maybe it's like, this is what we're made of, this is where we come from. And like she reminds me of like a campesina, because my mom would wear those handkerchiefs, you know, when she worked in nurseries and fields and stuff like that. So.
And then, okay, so anybody want to add on to that? This collective interpretation, like building on what Cynthia's saying? Yeah, go
It kind of looks like it's just highlighting the capabilities of a woman. They can be a mother, they can be revolutionary, they can be religious, intellectuals. It's just kind of throwing everything up there about what the Chicana Mexican women have been known to do, that, you know, represents what they've been capable of and still are.
And I like that positive picture of it, what they're capable of, because I think there's also an aspect of like inspiration, like perhaps this artist is inspired by both of these women, right? But at the same time, there's like a limit that's happening because you were saying like went into church because of being limited, right? And this woman, while she's probably working in the fields or somewhere with the bandana on, and she has these kids, and she's probably, you know, got a lot to do in her life that she's maybe limited also from making these types of pursuits of like science and art and writing. So while there's this like vision of what's possible, there's also a little view of the limitations of it. And then we didn't really touch on to this. Well, this symbol is like a Catholic religious symbol, but also merging with it like that spiral symbol of a more ancient, like you were saying, but it's actually in multiple cultures. That's like a symbol of continuity and life progression and things coming and the cycle of life, really. It's in a lot of different cultures. Okay, so we had the idea of women, Mexican woman, Mexican American woman, Chicana woman. This is the artist who definitely identifies as a Chicana artist right now today, so I thought she was a good example. And one of the things I'm going to take a moment to say is you can't really, people will self-identify as Chicano or Chicana. It's not so much like, oh, that person is that, because it's a political identity. It's like being a feminist. Like, it's not just being, like all women are necessarily identifying as feminists, but it's when one does, it's like a political identity, and Chicano and Chicana is similar to that. Is that what you guys have found in your other lectures? Is that what you've been talking about? Yeah, okay. So same with art and artists, it's the same thing. So this artist that I'm showing you, they do identify as that. So I think that's an important thing to know. It's not like me picking out going, oh, this is what it looks like. No, it's like, okay, these are Chicano artists, let's see what they're making. So here we have John Valadez, who's actually one of the well-known artists from the Chicano movement of like the 70s. And this is a mural, so it just has the address of the mural, so it's on South Broadway in Los Angeles. And while this one, what you guys really nicely discussed, this one has to do with like identity and also religion and culture and being a woman and some of the both benefits and limitations, or some of the both possibilities and limitations. This one is a different kind of subject, but all of these are things that many Chicano artists deal with, so that's why I chose these. So what do you see here? And this one, since it's so representational, so that means we can identify what this is. It's not abstract, it's not surreal, it's really representational. And you can even just say, like, this is what this thing is. So as opposed to, we could do two things. We could say, I see a woman in the center, in a white dress, there's a tiered cake next to her, there's a picture, you know, in the background are women with their hands raised up, reaching for something. So that's more like a description, right? But we also can just identify this as a wedding ceremony, right? So here we see a wedding ceremony, it's outside. It's like what John Valadez did a lot really well is he's very much a realist or representational painter, and he would paint his neighborhood, his society, his culture, his family, the people around him, and he would just create depictions of that. And so this is one of them, and he has many others. If you guys are interested in this type of work, it's really amazing. And he had a show at East Los Angeles College just a couple of years ago as well. And then at that school, they have the Vincent Price Art Museum, which is a great museum for Latin American and Chicano art. So if you guys are interested, it's a great place to go. And he had a show there. So anyway, so this is depicting like a neighborhood, a family, a celebration. Anyone have any comments on this one? Before we go on? I know we didn't dissect it quite as much. Yeah?
I thought it was interesting just on the side left corner how it's just like kind of the zoomed in image of the hands at the bottom. I thought that's like pretty unique because I didn't know you could really pay attention to that at first. But
and then once you saw it, it draws you.
Yeah.
Why do you think the artist might have used that idea of like close
probably like
order?
connecting or like bonding, like the kind of like the intimacy that they share.
Yeah, nice. Because there are these clasped hands, right? So for those of you guys in art, this is kind of maybe more familiar, and those of you coming from somewhere other department, you may or may not be familiar with that. But for sure in art, there's you can all see it slightly differently, but there's like a range of interpretations, right? So this idea of the range grows out of this particular piece. And what you're talking about with these hands up close, I love that idea that to you it symbolizes like their union. And that's a great way of seeing it. And when we talk together to understand art, we kind of build our understanding. And so I like that addition of that idea he added. Another reason why artists might do that is to kind of draw you in. The same way there's this almost like a straight vertical line here on the dress. So it is the dress, but it's very like linear, and that's creating that idea of action. So it's just like, whoosh. So there's a lot of action and activity. And then like you said, like a closeness, both like it's close, but also like their bond and closeness. And then at the same time, it kind of takes you in, it takes you over here. So it brings you through the piece, almost like you're moving along with it or dancing along with the people. And it's outside, it's in a neighborhood. It's not in like a formal hall, it's not in even the church. It's like the celebration outside after the ceremony. Does anybody look at this and feel like, oh, I've seen something like this?
Yeah, at my aunt's house.
At your aunt's house. Anyone else? No one else?
It's like a style during that time where they
Yeah.
dress a certain way. And
Yeah.
pictures too were like a bouquet and the hand, and then like there is the same cake, the same idea.
And a lot of his paintings, it's like that. It's the 70s, it's the neighborhood, it's the families, and if you see them, this is familiar to you, you'll probably have that same feeling with a lot of them. His work. So we started here with this idea of celebration, right? But then there's also family. So these are some of the motifs that you're going to see: the spiritual religious, the culture and the celebration, the neighborhood. Here we have family. So not only family, but specifically the artist's mother. And this is by Roberto Chavez, and he's also one of the key important Chicano artists from that same time period. And he actually taught at East Los Angeles College, and he actually created a mural on site there that was so debated that he ended up leaving his tenured job because they took it down, and he was so appalled. And it was really interesting because it shows you the way that it's a mural and it's art, but it's so aggressively challenging to the people interpreting it, not to his mind. So aggressively challenging the structures that be. It was challenging the hierarchy of the university. It was showing like a non-hierarchical view of learning, and it got taken down, and there was a big... He left because of it, so he really stood by it. So he is a very interesting artist. And this piece, though, is like, I just love this painting. It's just so like sort of simple and beautiful, and it shows his love of his mother. And so we see the woman, right, with their hands clasped in her lap, and she's got this wrap, and she's in like a kitchen, and she probably looks like a lot of people's mothers and a lot of like grandmothers, and like the way that a lot of the mothers and grandmothers are holding together a lot of these, their family and their community, especially in like East LA. That's really super prominent. So I thought that was an interesting one to show. What do you guys think about this one? What style would you call this? Do you know? It's representational because we could see what's represented, right? The woman. But it's also more loose. It's a little bit more like expressionistic.
I guess he's saying a statement. Not a statement, but just put like, cause just the fact that she's like in the kitchen, so I'm guessing he has cause that applies to, I guess, to all of us in any culture. A lot of times we place our mother in the kitchen, but he actually did that, like, you know, so he's probably like,
Yeah, it's true.
like cooking, all that stuff. I guess she took charge of the big family banquet and all those things. Cause
Yeah.
it's like, obviously, ours, when you do something, you choose the place when you do your drawing, right?
Yeah, you choose where to place her, and he placed her in the kitchen. Yeah. What do others think about that idea of the mom in the kitchen? Do you agree that it's like the mom taking care? I think it does represent that care and feeding of the family, right? But if we think about it in relationship to the first painting, talking about the different potentialities that a woman has, then it's slightly different, and then it's interesting to think that was a woman painter and this is a man painting his mother. So I don't think he's like putting her down. I think he's celebrating her and thanking her, and I think he's honoring her. But it's definitely one view of women and motherhood. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit. So here's another one by Roberto Chavez, Incident in El Salvador. This is more expressionistic, so in terms of a style. And this one is specifically relating to all the violence that was happening in El Salvador at the time. And I think that it also brings in one of those ideas of depicting social injustice. That is another important part of Chicano art. So not just doing something and engaging community, but actually depicting what it is that's happening. So there's family, and there's celebration, and there's religious iconography, but there's also a strong lineage of social painting and showing social protests and through art. So I thought that it was an important one to include for that same reason. I mean, it's hard to look at, because even though it's a painting, like the violence is so profound. But it's important to show this and to look at this, because a lot of people weren't talking about it, especially here in the US. You know, a lot of people weren't really aware of what was happening.
Was this done here or the?
Yeah, he's from here. He's from East Los Angeles, so Southern California. And along those same lines, we have this piece by Esther Hernandez, Sun Mad. And this one is a print, so similar to the first one that we looked at. And we see that, you know, the sun-made raisin box, right? It's very familiar. Everybody's probably seen that. And so replacing the woman with the skeleton and talking unnaturally grown with insecticides, midicides, herbicides, and fungicides. So Esther Hernandez is also, again, identifies as Chicana artist, and this is one of her most iconic works. You can imagine why, because she took an icon and reshaped it, and was really powerfully addressing this social and environmental issue of farming, and farming being taken, the pesticides and the chemicals and the very dangerous chemicals involved with the farming that impacted those who were working in the farm, so like the farm workers and the many immigrants who end up having that job, as well as the people eating the food, and as well, you know, the foods that we're consuming. So she was just talking about like kind of the hidden death of that. Like we're seeing, oh, it's just so bright and sunny, it's the sun-made raisin girl. But no, actually, there's something really dangerous happening that people aren't talking about. So another well-known, really important Chicana artist is Judith Baca. And this one is her piece called A Vision of the Future Without Fear. And this one does bring in a little bit of like a surrealistic quality, which is, I think that it's important too, because why I showed a little bit of variety in the beginning, there's different approaches to art. It's not like, oh, you're a Chicano artist, you make this kind of work. There's a lot of variety. We saw performance and presentation and realistic work and more abstract. This one has like a surreal quality, but also it has that sense of like love and caring. Right? So these hands embracing this like baby head, but it's like this egg or oval shape, and the river is going into it, and do you see how these are like the planets? So there's this like universal, like this, the individual and the universal coming together, the individual being, but then this like whole universe that it's describing. And this idea of the future without fear. So being able to just not be afraid, to just move forward and to not be living in this type of community that it's plagued by violence and some of the issues that like Oscar was fighting against and the riots and the farm workers. So saying no, moving into a future without fear and racism. So I think it really has this very, and this is a mural. She did a lot of murals as well as individual paintings. Okay, so in the next little chunk, we're going to talk more about the history. So we're going to look at some of the historical events that fed into Chicano art movement. And what I think this piece here is by an earlier 1999. That's not actually right. Check that date. Sorry, I know that date's wrong because he was from like the 40s. But anyway, this is by Hernando Villa, who was one of the early Mexican American artists. It was prior to anyone identifying as Chicano, and he created this painting of this native chief, and it was for the Southern California Railroad. It was used as their logo. It became really widely disseminated. And I think that what we're going to talk about in this next section is this idea of what's left out of history or any mainstream narrative is as important as what remains. What does that mean? What do you guys think that means? Like, what's left out? How do we know what's left out?
It's kind of like you only hear history from the victors and not from losers.
The way you say that. Yeah, no, exactly. That's what it is, the history told by the victors. Yeah. That's very much what this is about. Exactly. That idea that, that's who's writing the history and telling what happened. And so we missed a lot of things. And that's true of art history as well. Art history is not left out of that. It's actually got some problems in relationship to that, actually. So, so what's left out is as important as what remains. So if we try to look at a whole history and not just this very, Western view of history. How many of you guys have read Howard Zinn? One! Yay! Only one of you. Okay. So also, how about Rodolfo Acuña? Also one. Oh my goodness, you guys. I think you will love these writers. Okay, so you want to say anything about either one? How do they both relate to this? Can you tell everyone?
Howard Zinn books kind of talk about this kind of people's history, this kind of history of what we don't learn about. So what he does is focus on his book, which is one of the reasons why I became history major.
Oh,
That made a revelation to me when I came out of high school.
Yeah.
So it was a completely different history than what we were taught.
You're like, how come I didn't know?
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah,
I had the
exactly.
same response when I read it.
And Adolfo Acuña was a while back.
That's okay.
But he's a Chicano historian as well. He writes about, is it occupied America?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he just,
The Mexican-American War.
Yeah.
And he tells it from a different... Okay, so Howard Zinn, like she said, with People's History of the United States and several other books, it's always about looking at the history that was left out of typical American history. So when he talks about the Native Americans and stealing their land and murdering them, he gets archival letters and different ephemera with their points of view and their statements, and they're included in there. And it's talking about what did they experience, as opposed to just, they were the victims and they were wiped out and we move on. So, I'm obviously oversimplifying because history never is that clear and simple, but you know what I mean? That's kind of the narrative that we take away. This is a very different narrative. It brings in the points of view that aren't typically emphasized. And usually the marginalized people and the people living, who are living in poverty or doing the work of others, and they're not the ones who are highlighted in most history books. And that's who's highlighted in those books. And then Rodolfo Acuña did the same thing for occupied America, about the Mexican-American War. It's really amazing, and I think that if you guys are interested in this topic at all, you would really like it. Not specific to art, but to these same ideas. So another historian who looks at Chicano history is Chan Noriega, and he wrote the book that you guys are getting raffled off. So if you didn't get a raffle ticket when you came in, they're doing this raffle of this book. So, right? And it's his book that he edited, which I use in my class when I teach Chicano art. And I think it's a great book, and it addresses kind of similar to the way I'm looking at different exhibitions, and then what do we learn through that. So anyway, you'll see if you get the book. So he's the head of Chicano Research Center at UCLA, and that is the most expansive library holding the material related to Mexican Americans and other Latinos. And he also edits a journal called Aztlan, Journal of Chicano Studies. And I just want to read this quote that he has here. We've gone from a point 40 years ago where the center represented a minority population in LA, and now it's representing the majority population that continues to have disproportionately low levels of access to higher education, and yet is the future of the state and of the nation. It's pretty powerful, right? So I thought that was particularly pertinent here at a university, because it's important to remember and to also, celebrate yourself if you're in that situation where you're going to school and maybe one of the person in your family. So there is a disproportionately lower level of access to higher education, and at the same time to extend from that to art. And that's going to bring us into some of the community-based practices that we're going to look at later. So while these are, these are super important. I'm actually going to go slightly quicker over the history so we can go and look at some of the community-based art, but I do want to mention this because these are really important and led to Chicano movement and Chicano art. So we talked earlier with that one picture about the zoot suit, right? And do you guys already know the story of the Sleepy Lagoon murders and the zoot suit riots that followed? How many know? Raise your hand. Only a few. Okay, so we'll just say, so you get a context, because I think it's important to understand why this art is so connected to community and social issues. Because these are the people who were making this art are growing out of a very marginalized place where they were dealing with pretty extreme racism and poverty and violence. And so it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to help like my neighborhood. It's like that was their own neighborhoods that they wanted to change. And not just change the neighborhoods, but change the structures that created that. So the Sleepy Lagoon murders was a couple were like picnicking, in this area, Sleepy Lagoon, having like a little outing. And then some guys came and like beat them up. And then the guys who got beat up, him and his girlfriend, he went and got his friends. And he brought all their friends back. And they were like, we're going to get revenge. Kind of like a typical fight revenge story that happens in lots of neighborhoods all over the world to this day. So he brings back all his friends. And at the same time, there's that happening. At the same time, unrelated to that, there's a birthday party. And there's a man who went to the birthday party just prior to joining to enlisting in the Navy. I think it was the Navy, no, U.S. Armed Forces. And so he was at this party, and then the guys come to avenge, their friend and his girlfriend who were beat up, and they have this huge fight, and women and children, family members, terrible mayhem. And in the process, the enlistee is killed. He's found the next day, and he's murdered. And so it's a tragedy. And what happened that followed it was also tragic, because the way that the police responded was that they just rounded up all the Mexican-American boys and young men in the neighborhood, just rounded up like all of them. And we're dealing with this still, right? Because just this past year we had so many like police killings, and we're still dealing with this same issue. But so they rounded them all up, and they had a trial, and they ended up convicting one of them, but it was never clear what actually happened or who did what. But the response was so, whoa, my goodness, that was crazy. The response was just like that, like clamp down, like that noise that we just heard. So I'm not going to try to force that into the narrative, but it was a very strong response by the police. And so the Mexican Americans, in response, kind of like that first supper after the riot that we saw, where it was like, no, we're going to be here, we're going to claim our space, we're going to not just like disappear. So the zoot suits was that outfit, like you guys saw, the patuco, the long coat, right? It's very dramatic, it's very highly stylized. And so they were wearing those suits, and, not all the time, not just all the time, not just right after this. But very shortly after that, in response to the Sleepy Lagoon murders, is when the zoot suit riots happened, which is when a whole bunch of servicemen started fighting with these guys in the zoot suits, and it was just a terrible, terrible mayhem. And that was all in 1942, and there was just like so much racism against Mexican Americans and so much violence, specifically targeting them, that it's what led to both the Chicano movement as well as then within that, the Chicano art. But it's not the only thing, because there's also this idea of white flight that was happening at the time where people were, like so-called white flight, it should have like quotation. People moving out of the cities into these new urban developments, which created much more divisions between cultures and like highlighted the economic divisions so that it left the inner cities. And that's probably why they're called inner city now, right? Because it was like the city that remained, whereas there was all these suburbs around it. And it left those inner cities without resources. And it's when a lot of the cities started to have these much more poverty-stricken neighborhoods without access to the same kinds of public resources, because the people who maybe had the funds to pay the taxes were leaving and going to live in the suburbs. And because of our country and the way that it works, that typically was white people, where there was more Mexican American and black people left in the cities. So that also is one of the things that led to this. And finally, the United Farm Workers that we talked about earlier, and I think you guys are probably familiar with, and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and fighting for the immigrants' rights. So those things created this context for the art that we've looked at and that we're going to be looking at. So this tells more about that, which is going to tell it better than what I just told, but I gave you my version. And if you want to just take a minute to read it, I think it will help you to understand. But I think this is important, right? Building up over years. It wasn't just that one incident, obviously. So what do you think it means that the city will be forever changed? Why? Or is that even true? Was it always already that way? I don't know. I asked that question, and now I'm thinking, well, maybe you even don't think it changed. It's okay. We have a lot more to see, so I'll go on to the next thing, which is, I won't pose it as a question. I just want us to be thinking throughout this last part, how does cultural history influence not only the art that's made, but our view of art? So it's something that we kind of forget to consider, right? It's not just what art is made, but how do we see art, and what art do we see? And going back to that idea that I said earlier in this little section of what's left out of history. Because why do we even have, I mean, on the one hand, we have Chicano art because it's special, that it was these people who had this purpose and this strong will and desire to change their communities and to be artists and to impact the world in that way. But on the other hand, why is it like separate, right? Why isn't that just part of the whole narrative that we hear when we learn about art history? So I think that that's an important question to think about. So here we have a mural by East Los Streetscapers, and they were like moving forward a little bit now into the 80s and 90s. They were creating murals all throughout East LA and like Coima here you see, and different areas of Southern California. And here's one of them, and this was actually made at the school where Judith Baca went to elementary school. So that was pretty cool, and I think she was part of making this one. So there's this idea of Chicanismo. Have you guys heard of that idea before? No. Yes? No. Mix of answers. So this comes from the art historian Marcos Sanchez Tranquilino, and he was studying murals, the Chicano murals. And he came up with this idea called Chicanismo to describe the complex of nationalist strategies by which Chicano origins and histories, as well as present and future identities, were constructed and legitimized. And I think it's important to recognize the way they say Chicano identities, right? So it's not just one, there's not just one view of what that means, there's multiple views. And I think that's an important thing to be aware of, as well as the idea that there's this complex of nationalist strategies by which Chicano origins and histories and present and future identities were constructed and legitimized. So where this comes from is not just like this simple narrative. Well, you guys know this, so I don't have to tell you this. But sometimes when you look at a presentation and we lay it out, it seems like, oh, that's the way it happened. No, it's just like one view that I'm taking in this particular presentation to show you particular things. But it's a complex, a complexity of historical and social and cultural things that come together to create these identities and this work that you see in the murals and the other pieces that we're looking at. So more than that, so Chicanismo provided a context for historical reclamation of the self through the affirmation of Chicano culture narratives while resisting Anglo models of assimilation. So against that idea of the melting pot, like, oh, we're all going to assimilate, we're all going to be part of like the whole happy family, which actually means like all part of the traditional Western European white American culture, right? So that's like a melting pot. This was different. This was like, no, we don't have to assimilate. We're going to reclaim our own historical origins, but then make it new within this environment of this culture and this country. So that's what that Chicanismo is about. And I thought this was a great, kind of powerful image to address that. This is a mural in the Estrada housing projects in East Los Angeles. We are not a minority. I think this already relates, so we're thinking back to OSCO that I started with, that idea of reclaiming your space. And then talking about Chan Noriega's when he was saying that we're no longer the minority, like the Chicanos and Latin Americans, or Latinos. So I think that this kind of, I love the way that this captures it, but this is from 1978, right? So it's not like it's yesterday. So when we think about what defines Chicano art, where does the art reside? On the wall, in the mural, in the artist, in the viewer, in the community, or in all of those? And I think one of the questions that I think is really important that we can't answer right now today, but that to leave, to have you thinking about is who decides. So I think that's really something that we forget. We just take it in, this is told in this class or this book or whatever. But there's so many views. Who decided that's in the book versus the other thing? Like Howard Zinn is a perfect example of that. What do you guys think? What defines it and who gets to decide? It's such a bigger question. But if anyone has any answers right now, we can hear them before we move on.
I've always connected Chicano with the movement, something political activist. I cannot see it without, that's not political.
How many people feel similar to Eden with that? There's like a political identity with it. So a fair amount of you guys, yeah. Yeah, it's connected specifically to that. And when you say political, like what else with that? Does anybody want to add to that? Yeah.
Well, I'm taking a ChicanoLecture class, and we're reading poetry this past week, and we're reading Delgado. And I seen a couple of his interviews, and he was saying that Chicano, when you look at Chicano, it's just a noun that it gains power from the ownership that we take over it. So in the past, Chicanos, they were given a label that you're Hispanic, you're Latino, but Chicano is a word that we kind of took as our own, and through that, we're given in power.
That's beautiful. I really love the way that you say that, and thank you for sharing that. It's great that it came out of studying that, and also specifically poetry, because it's kind of like what I was saying earlier with the artist. You can't say, "Oh, that's a Chicano artist." Chicano. It's a self-identification, and it's being part of a movement, like a political and social movement. That's beautiful. I really like that. So some of this idea of Chicano, but then there's also like Latino, like you're saying, it's more a label given to someone. So that's a good distinction. And then there's people who don't identify with that, right? And they just identify Mexican American, but they don't identify with that Chicano. It's not to say it's better or worse, but it is a very specific like self proclamation. And so some of the artists, like this one, doesn't necessarily identify with Chicano, but she kind of owns it too. She's very like hybridized identity, and she's Japanese American, but she grew up in East LA. She's Usaldemando, so I think she's a good example of like contemporary approaches to Chicano art because it's not so specific to her heritage, because she's Japanese American, but she grew up in East LA, so it's much more like cultural and the culture that she brought with her and that she grew up with, even though now it's not specific to like she's not Mexican American. So I think that's an interesting example. And what she does is she paints and draws, mostly draws, her friends, the people around her. As you can see here, it's very realistic, very detailed, very kind of like these girls hanging out. One's got the pink hair. They're kind of like, what is it? Oh yeah, in between sets. So you could just imagine like at a concert. And this is most of her work. And I think it's so great because it's very detailed and highly time-consuming in terms of the process. And it's like elevating these just regular kids from the neighborhood that she knows. It's all her friends. She's been drawing her friends for like 20 years. So you start to see the changes over time. And Juan Capistran is also a newer contemporary artist. This one is actually photos. It's a photo, but of kind of like a performance. It's called The Breaks. So that's him. And it's so interesting how his body movements become like elements of design almost, right? But then within each one, there's like this whole lifelike movement happening. But as a whole, in the shape of a grid, there's like this, they're almost like elements of design. So it's very contemporary and very like using the photography. And this one came out of something that I want to just, I'm going to show you guys something else real quick, because this one came out of something that I think will be, I wonder if this will work. No. Okay, I'm going to get this one for you guys. Okay, so this one came out of a show called Phantom Sightings, which was what's happening with Chicano art now, right? So art after the Chicano movement. So I think this is a really interesting one to think about too, because this was looking at, well, what else is happening? What happens next? Let me see. Oh yeah, that's why I didn't pull that one, because they didn't give us more pictures, but that's okay. So I think that that's a really good one. It's just another way to think about, well, where do we go now? Because it's different. It's always changing and growing and evolving. So we're not going to look at more contemporary, because the last little chunk of information that I want to share is related to something really important to Chicano art, both historically and contemporarily, and that's that idea of community, collaboration, and collectives. So we started with that with, you guys remember, who do we start with? What was the name of the group we looked at? ASCO, yeah. So we started with ASCO, right? This is a different kind of a group, because it's not an artist collective. This is a community organization. How many of you guys have heard of Self-Help Graphics? Oh, so this is great. We're going to learn something new. Okay, I mean, a lot of it. I'm happy if you guys haven't heard of these things, so that you get something out of this. So Self-Help Graphics began in 1973. It's an arts organization. It's a nonprofit organization in East LA. So it's different from ASCO, which was really, they're like artists who functioned as one. So it's an artist versus like an arts organization, right? But very about the community and about giving an opportunity for Chicano artists. And I think it's important in light of what we were just saying, like what you mentioned about that self-identification, that they include by Chicano and Latino artists, because they're not going to also identify, oh, you have to be this or that, right? So I think that that's an important recognition of that idea that you were just talking about. So from 1973, they're a nonprofit visual arts center. They serve predominantly Latino community of East Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, but it's actually East Los Angeles. And yeah, so they're all about driving the creation of new work by Chicano and Latino artists, and primarily printmaking, but they do have other art forms. They have a print studio. They also have, which I think is one that I'm going to show you guys a little bit more of, the Barrio Mobile Art Studio. And that also started in 1974, but then it stopped for a while, and then it returned in 2014. And it takes art into the street with programming for youth and multi-generational workshops. And it also gives opportunities for artists in the community to work. So why would they go off into the community to bring the art? Why can't they just go to the art center? Anybody?
It's not available anywhere, everywhere.
Yeah, it's not available everywhere, right? I mean, this particular one, it's right there in East LA, right? So that's kind of there. But what about sometimes like just transportation? You know, somebody like even having the means to get to a art center, or maybe knowing about it, or maybe, and those of you guys who are in my classes know, because we always talk about this idea of access to arts and like socioeconomic and cultural barriers to that access. So sometimes it might just be right next door to you, but you don't go because you don't feel like that's something for you. Like I've heard, I was recently in Chicago and I went to this area in the south side of Chicago, this beautiful art center that was, about taking an abandoned building and turning it into an art center and creating a space in the community for art. And I was talking to this guy for a while and he says, yeah, nobody comes from our neighborhood. We want them to come, but then people like you come from the outside and see what we have here. And he's like, always, I was like, do you do school trips? Invite them in. And I think, they're trying to do things and they will. But it's that same idea where, unfortunately, over time, art has sort of created a space for itself almost separate from like society and communities. And so there is this barrier to access. So in groups like Self-Help Graphics, or even like our group here on campus, community-based art, that some of you guys work with me on, it's all about saying, okay, well, let's just make it accessible to more people in whatever way makes the most sense. Yes?
I just think sometimes people are scared too, like if they've never been exposed to art and they're like, how do we approach this, or what do we do? And like even like personally, like families that I've worked with, like they didn't know they were allowed, like they're invited to come to these events. So like whenever I've worked in like the community, like we make it a point to do art workshops so that people know like this is open to you as well. You are welcome. I think like maybe that's why they inserted themselves inside the community, because that's the best way to get,
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like people, it's not like anyone's fault if they don't never done art or they just don't have time because they're like working all day and then another job at night. They don't think of it as something they can do oftentimes, or it just didn't know it was available. So exactly for those reasons, yeah, they go right out into the community with this mobile art studio and just make opportunities happen right there in the community. And like Cynthia and Lindsay and Savannah, you guys here today, they're part of this group that we have here on campus in the art department that I oversee called Community-Based Art. And we do the same thing. We don't have a mobile studio. We just go into the places. So we go into different facilities here in the community and prisons and bring art there. So it's kind of a similar idea. So one other project it is a similar idea, and it grows out of the same philosophy. I shouldn't say sort of, it is. So one of the projects I want to show you from Self-Help Graphics is one that I actually just learned about recently when I was putting all of this together for you guys. I always try to bring in something new that I'm not as familiar with, and this one is one I didn't know about. So I thought I would share it with you. It's called Soy Artista Mi Barrio, and it's a temporary project to engage youth. So it does have a lot of overlap with what we do with this community-based art program. And it started from a group of young artists, and they came together and they wanted to think about their community and how they could engage youth in the community, and also what is their role as young artists in the community. So I thought that was pretty great that it grew out of these young artists. There's actually another one here in San Bernardino. I should have brought that one in too, called Generation Now. Is anybody part of that? Anybody here? Generation Now? No? Okay. So that's actually started by an alumni of TSUSB, and they're doing very similar things, but more like in mural making. This is actually engaging the youth. They're going out in San Bernardino communities and doing these murals, and so they're a great one to know about too. Generation Now. Okay, back to the Soy Artista. So the idea is that it allows the artists to share their views of the neighborhoods. So they created 15 banners, and they were focusing on different topics that they addressed when they came together to talk about their community. So use of public space, food equity. It's an interesting one to think about. We don't talk about that very often. It's important. Transportation, and themes of cultural preservation and affirmation. So that idea of affirmation, that goes back to that idea of reclamation of space, right? Affirming like who I am and this is my community. So this is one of the banners. And it has the artist, Izzy Jaquiez. It's hard to read. And Leonardo Vichisarate. What do you guys see?
We see in the streets of the neighborhood, taco truck, elote man, paletero, pan dulce.
Exactly, right? Anybody else? Do you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
Oh, you look like you
I
do.
know what he said, I'm not familiar with, so it's like.
Yeah. Let's see it. So let's see it so everyone can. Can you say it again in English?
Like
Yeah.
The second thing, the third thing from the
Yeah.
right, what is that?
So elote is the corn, and they eat the corn on the like you guys. You want to say more about the corn? I love that corn. There's people selling the corn in a lot of different neighborhoods with the little cart.
Yeah.
The school I used to work at, they're always selling that.
But I know it's always los panes en la concha.
Right here?
But I know.
I don't know what this one is.
That's a conchita.
What's that? A bread?
But I know what's up with
Okay, so
banana.
this one it's a bread. Yeah, the banana.
I think it's also
A bread?
Oh, it's un bolillo.
Un bolillo? Okay, so that's like a type of bread too. You know that one. Okay. And not just to point you out, there's probably others in here who's Spanish, English. We'll just say in both. This one, the paleteros, like they sell the popsicles, right? So then the popsicle, the
It's something
paleta.
that you're not gonna see like in suburbia.
Right. Suburbia, it's a good example. You what?
Oh, see that rancho cucamonga.
There's a
Right.
There's a lot of Mexicans, though you will. Like,
You will? So then you'll
if
see.
you go to a Mexican neighborhood, you will see that.
And here's like the taco truck, and then this guy selling it on his head. This one I'm not familiar. Do you guys see this?
That's in Mexico, like
Oh.
in Guadalajara, where we're from. Like the man selling the bread in the morning, so he like puts it on his head, like it's like a box. He'll carry it that way, and
okay.
he knows which
I've
families
been
are
to
always
that one.
looking forward to the bread and stuff. Yeah, so he knows where to go.
Yeah.
It's really nice.
I love these pieces by these young artists. I was like, oh, I wanted to show you guys all of them because I was so excited. But I did show you two more, so let's look at two more. So this one is by an artist named Gabriela. What does that say? Hola? That's hard to read, sorry. So it's great, right? You guys want to read that? Let's all read that out loud. What's that say? Thank you. Only like some of you read. But that's an important message, right? And it's not just because I love cats that I love that one. I just thought it's so clever and so awesome that this young woman artist made that piece. Because who doesn't recognize this, right? You guys know what this is about. A lot of people, like I think girls and women everywhere can relate to this. It's not just about like this East LA neighborhood. This is everywhere. I went to Spain. I was walking past a construction site and they're like doing this. I was like, oh my God, even here. So like it's universal. So this is so great that this young girl did that. I love that. So that one's kind of self-explanatory, right? And then look again, the corn, and then in the middle, the little houses, and the moon is the peace sign. It's so beautiful. What?
That I don't understand.
You don't understand?
Yeah, like
How come?
corn brings peace or what?
Well, I think it's more like this one, it's more symbolic, right? So we talked about a few kinds of art representation, a little bit of surreal, a little bit of abstract. This one I think is more symbolic. So there's the hand holding the corn. What's that like symbolic of?
Like if you think about it, maíz is, corn is a huge staple in Mexico, and that's basically what made, that's like where our food comes from, like tortillas, like it's very based, you know, so it's very symbolic and it's very important, you know.
And it
It's
goes all the way back, right,
goes
to
all the way
Mexico,
back to
and
the
then way
Aztecs.
before to the
Yeah.
Aztecs, and it's like a form of a deity almost.
Yeah, it was. There was a
There was a yeah.
God. Like, yeah, it's definitely very symbolic.
So there's like a long history. So it's not just the selling the corn. I think in this case it is talking all the way back to the.
It means family. It means so many things, you know.
Does anyone else also agree or have other things to say about the corn? Yeah, you agree? You see it? How about the little houses at night and the peace sign? I mean, to me, what I think about with that is I think about the way that this neighborhood that they're coming from, the multiple neighborhoods they're coming from, there's a lot of violence in the community that they're having to struggle with. So to me, seeing this little houses and the peace sign at night, it feels like, kind of reminds me of Judith Butler's piece about the future without fear, like being able to have a neighborhood where you just feel like comfortable and safe and at peace at night. I think that's one view of it. Is that the only view? No, of course it's art, so there's other ways of seeing it. So another way of seeing it is just the solace of nighttime and like going to sleep and being with your family and that kind of idea. So that's like another way of seeing it. And they're not right or wrong, there's just different views. Does someone have a different view besides one of those about the little house with the moon? Did you have something? No, I thought you raised your hand. Right there, no, okay. She's like, no. Okay. Okay, so that's that project. And then, where did you go? It's 224, is that right? Okay, so good. So I have one more thing to show you. So this is an exhibition that, well, this is not an exhibition, this is an exhibition that I curated, and it opened at Otis College of Art and Design, and then it traveled here to RACMA. Did anybody see it when it was here? Okay, so like a little handful. So we're going to look at some of these images, and then we're going to look at one more different thing in the end. So this exhibition brings, so one of the artists identifies as Chicano artist. One of them does not, because it's not that he's against it, he's just like, I want to just be seen as human. He's like, I'm Mexican and I'm human. And that's his identities, and he doesn't adopt the other ones. And that's cool, and that's fine, and I think it's interesting that they're so different. The third one, Alex Kizu, so Fabian does. Alex does not. He's Japanese American, grew up in East LA, doesn't really identify with either Chicano or Mexican American. And then Juan Carlos grew up in Mexico, was born here, and then came here, and he says, I don't know, I'm just human, humano, mexicano, like that's how he identifies. So I think it's important to see that there's different ways of adopting this, and everyone has to make the choice that's right for them. So the reason why I put this together was that I wanted to, I'm really interested in breaking down these kinds of divisions and borders that people erect between themselves and others. And I think that coming from art as an art writer and curator and artist, I see a lot of that in the art world where it's like, well, those kinds of artists show there and this one shows here. And like, I'm really interested in kind of shifting those boundaries. And so I saw these artists who were associated with this incredible group, Homeboy Industries, which I'll tell you about in a second. And they were making this incredible work and had been working on their art for, say, like 15, 20 years since they were little. And they hadn't really shown that much. And I thought, well, I want to try to exhibit their work in a space where people go and look at art and will expect to see, powerful art, but that they might not typically be showing in that space. And I was really happy when Otis College of Art and Design said yes, they would like to show it, because I felt like it was a perfect environment because it's an art school. And actually, Fabian really wanted to study there, but he didn't even have his GED, so he wasn't able to study there. So it was great to give him the opportunity to show his work there. And I wanted to say, not that it's bad I went to Otis, so of course I don't think it's bad to go get an upper division degree or any degree in art. I think it's great, but I don't think it's the only way, right? And these artists did it a different way, and I was like, let's look at that. What is that like? Not to say it's better, just it's different and it's not going to be really seen otherwise. So that's what that show is. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of work from it. But in case if you're not familiar with what Homeboy Industry is, just take a couple minutes and you could skim it. Or read it. You don't have to skim it. Better to read than skim. Are you guys good? Everyone finished? Okay. Okay, so I want to ask you something before we look at the art. So I already told you that artists, one item is Chicano, one Mexican, and the other one, none of the above. So what is it about this show that fits into this history? And I'm not Mexican American or Chicana. So what is it about this show that fits into Chicano? Like the ideas that I told you without even seeing it. Because I really think it's the ideas more than the art almost that makes it fit in with that. What do you think? Okay. Yay, take a stab at it. This is important.
They're a segment of the population that has been disenfranchised, just like the Chicano culture has been as well. So their voice is such as important as the Chicano as a whole, their voice as well. So.
Yeah, okay, good. Yes. Yes. Anyone want to add anything to that? You guys are so quiet like that.
They come from the same area, like that, definitely the, chola life and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It does, it is a reflection when it comes to Chicanos and Chicanas, like there's a lot of connection to that.
Part of it.
Yeah, it is very much a part of it,
Pachucos, that was the early version of
Yeah. So I think maybe like they come from the same hoods, they come from the same areas, they come from the same backgrounds, and I know a lot of people who are like a homeboy or whatever, like I have cousins who consider themselves Chicanos, and they do come from like a gangster lifestyle, so yeah.
So I think that, both of those coming together, it's interesting to hear, because I'm curious, like, what do you guys think when you hear this? And that's definitely, both of those are a big part of it. I think that idea of disenfranchisement is really important, because not only there's two levels, like disenfranchised from, maybe not so much the Chicano community, but like Mexican American community, right? Like, of course, if someone's in a gang, they're more like disenfranchised, and from society as a whole, let alone just their community, they're very disenfranchised, especially if someone's like returning from prison. So disenfranchised people, but then again, that's not all of them. They're all associated with homeboy industries, but they're not all associated with gangs, the artists. Two of them are, and one of them not at all. Were formerly associated with gangs. So there's that idea of disenfranchisement within society, but then also within art. So this idea of like, these are not artists who went and were educated in a formal way, so they're kind of disenfranchised from the mainstream art world. So to my thinking, my approach to curation is different from, like an art historian, or like maybe a more, traditional curator based in like ideas or media. Like to me, it's much more about how do we break down walls and put bridges up between people, and how do we kind of look at something different. Okay, we haven't really seen this art. How do we bring that into the conversation? Like someone who wouldn't necessarily be included otherwise. So to me, philosophically, it very much relates to the ideas of Chicano artists that we've been talking about. So I'll show you guys a little bit of this. But probably some of you guys have seen it, so. Okay, we don't need this anymore, although this is a great video, so if you're interested, you can watch that one another day. This has some nice photos of the show, so I'm just going to show it from here. So this was when it was in at Otis. So these are bronze sculptures, and this is a painting, and this is all by the artist Juan Carlos Muñoz Hernandez. And he's apprenticed with Robert Graham, and then who was a bronze sculptor who did the big Charlie Parker Memorial and many other large public sculptures, like more traditional statuary and memorial sculptures. And so Juan Carlos studied with him and learned bronze, but then at the same time he also was friends with Fabian and Alex, the other artists in the show, ever since they were little, and they all were consider Father Greg Boyle, who founded Homeboy Industries, to be a mentor, and that's what ties them together in terms of their history, but in terms of their art, they all work together on these street art pieces. So on murals with community members, they would talk to me about how if they're working on a mural in the community, they would just get everyone involved. Young people, old people, kids, anyone who's maybe disabled in a wheelchair, give them a paintbrush. They would just find a way to get everyone engaged and involved. And that's the community work. So they would do that kind of work together since they were little. Then they were also, Fabian and Alex were part of East Los Streetscapers, the one I showed you a mural by them earlier, which kind of like OSCO had these revolving members. So they would do street art and work on the walls, in the streets, not necessarily murals, but more like a piece that would just go up one night and no one would know who did it. And so his paintings, I think, are inspired by that street type of work, and his sculptures are more inspired by his work with Robert Graham. These paintings are by Alex Kizu, and he's inspired by imagery in the streets, literal calligraphy of graffiti and street writing, and how we kind of think of like, oh, just graffiti, just like something on the wall you want to get rid of. But he actually told me once he knows like 100 different calligraphy alphabets that he learned from people on the streets. And he uses all those different kinds of alphabets as inspiration for paintings. There's more of Juan Carlos. So you see it pretty well right there. These are his earlier works where he actually, oh, you can't see that very good. I'm sorry. Maybe we'll move on since you guys can actually see that very well. Okay, so we're going to move on because that's hard to see. So let's go back to this. Say okay. So the last thing I wanted to show, there's two more small bits, but the last thing I wanted to show you guys was actually some student work from the Chicano art class. Did any of you guys take that class? I feel like somebody did. Cindy, I thought that somebody did. I wonder if your piece is going to be in here. So I'm going to show you guys some student work, and the reason why is I want you to see the way that our art students, took these ideas that we're talking about and then created their own projects. So I didn't tell them, like, oh, make a painting or make a mural or write an essay. I said, I want you to create a project that embodies these ideas of community and of whether it's using, activism or the iconography or the performance or the community-based, whatever part of or parts of that, I want your project to embody that. So here's some of the things that they did. This piece is inspired by what tradition? What do you think? Anybody know? Can you tell by looking? Maybe not.
Is it Dia de los Muertos?
Yeah, it's inspired by Day of the Dead. And it's a little bit hard to see these, but these are images of people where you don't see the head, you see the hands, and they're holding food. Thank you for all your participation, guys. And you see the food. When she asked friends and family, if you had, if you could create a meal to give to a loved one who's passed away, what will that be? And she asked them to make the food. Then she took a, because on Day of the Dead, you leave on the altars, they'll be in like the, what do you call it, cemetery. In the cemetery, there'll be like flowers and food and families coming together and almost like parties. It's very festive. It's not like that somber, all wearing black type of thing that maybe we might think of if we grew up here. And it's very like festive, and you bring food to leave for the people who have passed. So she asked them to make the meal that they would create for someone who has passed, and then she took a photo of them with it, and then she had them, I think they ate it to like honor the person. And then on this dish, you could leave someone just coming by. There was like a participation element. They could leave what they would make for someone who had passed. And so there was this sort of evolving altar. So I thought it was a great way of embracing the idea of both engaging people in your art. So she didn't just take their picture. She had them create this meal and then eat it and then take the picture and then eat it. So there was this interaction through the piece. As well as in presenting it, there was a way for the viewers to participate. And then it also drew on the tradition of Day of the Dead. So that was one. This mural was created in the lobby of the art building, and it just was painted over, which was sad, but it had to go. I don't know the whole history of why, but it had nothing to do with the mural. Apparently, I guess it was only meant to be a year, but at the time they started it, we all didn't know, so we were kind of hoping it was going to stay up, but it's unfortunately no longer there. But it was a great representation of collaboration and public space and reclaiming public space, really, because they did do it right in the lobby of the mural. And right in the lobby of the building. And whether or not it was going to last, it was unclear in the beginning. And it was there for a year, which I thought was pretty great. So here's them working on the mural. You can see the way that they worked together, the way that they sketched it out. Some of them had never made a mural before, so they were really excited to have that opportunity. And here it is, almost finished with the artists. And there they are with their piece. And so for this one, what aspects of Chicano art do you think that they were drawing on? Let's see what we got out of this talk. Anybody?
I mean, their history.
Their history? What do you mean? Say more.
Well, there's at the pyramid, the way how like even how the Virgin Mary is drawn looks very Chicano.
Yeah.
Traditionally, you see Western style of the
Yeah.
Virgin Mary.
So great, right?
But,
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the imagery, the people being like more Chicano or Mexican American or Mexican, and also the Aztec, the pyramids. There's a lot of symbolism in this that I'm not going to go into all of them right now, but they drew on a lot of the idea of the symbolism and their culture and their history. And they also drew on collaboration and murals, right? So it's a mural. And that idea of public space. So you guys, some of you guys have seen this. Raise your hand if you've seen it. Only the art students. So sad. I wish we would have had like a big party for like overlap, because I feel like some of the history people might like. So anyway, okay, and then we have, this was a tortilla making workshop. And this artist, Maite, was a student in the class, and she created this. So this was a workshop where she made tortillas for anyone who was coming by. Very public, right there in the art patio, and it was for a whole day. So what aspects of her culture, or I'm sorry, not her culture, what aspects of Chicano art is she drawing on and embodying in this piece?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, so for all these student ones, I'm also kind of hearing, okay, what kinds of ideas about Chicano art did you guys get from this talk? So I want you to kind of tell me what aspects of Chicano art is each of these students drawing on in their piece. So for this one, what is she embodying or drawing on? Yeah.
I was thinking like collaboration, similar to like the one previous where they get like the community like involved in the process of making both together.
Yeah, getting the community involved and making the food for people, right? And very collaborative and very public and very, like, just breaking down that boundary of wall or museum altogether and putting it right out in space, definitely. This one really embraced that idea of, like, public engagement with the art. Is there any? And then of course the tortillas, right? So her own. She said, my mom would always make this, and I want to make this for people. And I thought, well, everyone probably has had it, but once she made it, she realized a lot of the people coming hadn't had this homemade tortillas. So she was interested in also like reclaiming that cultural, that experience of making the tortillas instead of buying them. And so that was the other thing that she was thinking about.
Have to want to add like one thing. Well, when I was little, like I would always hear like my abuelita when she was like rolling the pin like back and forth, and that would be like the first thing that would like wake me up in the morning. So that's like also like the connection that she's probably like sharing with the students, that they probably never had that connection that she's creating for them. So
that's so beautiful, and also that idea that everyone will have, like that idea I was talking about with art, everyone can have their own interpretation, but within the range of what the piece is giving. I think that's a great example, because if someone had that, like you, it brings back this memory, and it feels like sweet.
yes.
And then if someone has never had it, it's maybe offering that. So they're all, it's touching on all those things. And then one more, they created a mural together, and Cynthia, you would have liked this one. I'll show you really quick. She did tortilla making workshop. But we were talking all about that one. So, no, don't be sorry. I just went back to show you because I thought you would like it. So, okay. So for this one, they made this mural together. And yeah, so for this one, which aspects of Chicano art, from what we've been talking about, which ones did they kind of like embody and draw on to create this piece? I mean, there's the obvious one, right? That we talked about. What do you want to say? Anyone? So it's a mural, right? That's one part. Okay, good. What else? You guys are like, that's too obvious. But that's one thing we talked about, right? So what other parts of Chicano art is... So I asked them to bring in a few of the different aspects, not just one. So this is a mural. Anything else?
Well, I'm seeing the Mexican flag with the eagle and the snake.
Yeah, the symbolism from the Mexican flag, but then changed, right? So the eagle and the snake, but then reinterpreting them, not specifically the way it looks on the flag. Yeah, so the symbolism, the imagery from the Mexican flag. There's also the skull with the flowers, like the calaveras, like the beautiful decorative skull for Day of the Dead. And then look at this. There's like RX, like a drugs, prescription drugs, cans. What do you make of that part?
I mean, like, I feel it's kind of theme-wise also, because usually some of the common themes and murals is kind of like the struggle of the community, and I guess that's just what something that they've seen in their community, which I guess is drug abuse, alcohol, and gang, and so I feel like that's another thing that they're drawing from.
Yeah, good, exactly. So like what did they see in their community that's issue, and it draws on that, both the history of it that we saw, and then what are they seeing in theirs. Yeah, it's really well put. I like the way that you said that, exactly. And they did work together in collaboration, the two artists together, and that's, he was studying design, Brandon, that's April, some of you guys know April who works with us for community-based art. That was, she studies art history, but also drawing. So they kind of merged their styles. And it also, the last part, which you wouldn't know by looking, was that it was very temporary. It was put up, and then like a week later, it was painted over. And everyone was like, oh, so sad, it was so much work. It's almost like as soon as they were done, they painted over. But that was part of it, and that drew on, for them, that tradition of like street art. So not so much specific to murals, although this wasn't a gallery, but just that idea of it comes up and it goes down, and that's part of it. And even once it was up, people started saying, oh, it's so beautiful, we should leave it. And both of the artists were like, nope, that's part of the process. And so that temporary, that idea, kind of like Usco, right? Like, it was what we could make in this moment and put on our show. So I think that's an important part to remember. This is part of community-based art. We kind of, just in the past year, started calling it the Prison Arts Collective, part of that group, because there's so many of us working with the prison program. And this one is really inspired by a lot of these ideas that we're talking about. And we don't really have time to go into it, which is fine, because we only had one more slide anyway. But I think that it's important to think about the ideas of what we've been what I've shown you guys today and how they apply today in our world around us and how we can enact or embody them as opposed to just like looking at or talking about. But this is going out into the community, fulfilling a need for people that wouldn't otherwise have access to art. And we have between 15, 20 students, some of them here today, who go and teach all the, each week art programs at 3 prisons. And right now we have an exhibition, if anyone's interested to see the art. It's at CP1 Gallery, just opened Saturday. It looks amazing. It has 100 pieces of the artists from our program, and it's in a gallery in downtown LA. And I think that it goes back to that idea I was talking about with Bridging Home Art Industries, the idea of breaking down these barriers of what art goes where, and where we see, like what we get to see, who decides, like that idea of what's art and who decides. So while oftentimes people will think of art from the prison as like a certain genre of prison art that you would see in a certain kind of place, like a community setting, like Home Industries has a prison art show, great. But I thought, well, can we just see it as art, and can we see it in an art gallery and just see their work in a beautiful gallery space, and what will that look like to see it in that way and open up to, we had families of the artists come, we had like collectors come, we had a big range of people who attended the exhibition. So it's up for 2 more weeks if you guys are interested. And I'm hesitant if I want to show you the last slide, but I guess I will. This is the last slide, and this is by an artist in our program in the Chino prison. And I thought it was really interesting in relationship to this talk because he worked so hard on this piece. And he said to us, he said that he wanted to make a painting to show his feelings about Trump because he says, I crossed that border twice, and I know, what that's like. And I just think he's not respecting our experience. And this was his painting as a result of it. And while he's young and incarcerated and obviously had a lot of difficulty in his life and also made a lot of bad choices, he also is really trying to change his life and make a difference. And the fact that he's trying to express himself in something so contemporary that so many people can relate to. I don't know that he identifies Chicano or not. I don't know if he's even that aware of what it is. It's something, this Chicano art talk would actually be a good one to bring to that site. But I think that at this, even though he might not define that way, this piece to me speaks of a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about. So, I guess I'll just leave you with the questions because we won't have time to discuss them. But hopefully, moving forward from here, you guys can be thinking about what defines Chicano and Chicana art and the kinds of images and processes that characterize it, which we just discussed, looking at student art. So here's some resources if any of you guys want to learn more. And thank you very much for those of you who hung in there till the end. Thank you.